Hello everybody and welcome back. We're now going to start session 5 on autonomy and decision making. And with me is my co-host and colleague, Christina Fall from the Loris Hospice in Leicestershire. And our first speaker is Heike Gudat from Basel, talking about medical assistance in dying in Switzerland.
I welcome you to the next 20 minutes. My name is Heike Gudat. I am a palliative care physician and I prepared this speech together with Kathi Schweikert. She's the leading physician of the ALS clinic in Basel. In the next 20 minutes, you will hear something in the first part about the incidence of assisted suicide in patients in Switzerland and especially in patients with ALS. And in the second part, I will speak about motivations and attitudes of patients at the end of life toward wishes to die and end of life. These are patients coming from a big study, interview study that we made some years ago. Prevalence of ALS in Switzerland is about 500 to 600 people affected with ALS. We have 8 competence centers in Switzerland and Basel is the second largest. It is in the northern part, as you see the red bottom there in Switzerland. The ALS clinic of Basel is situated in the University Hospital of Basel and there in the competence center of neurological disease. It is led by Kathi Schweikert, the ALS clinic. And I don't know when it started really, because I know Kathi Schweikert for 20 years now and she was always dealing with ALS. And the clinic was growing and growing, and in the year of 21 they had 62 patients and about 1 new diagnosis of ALS per week. And you can imagine that this is a lot of work. She's working together with 4 other physicians and an ALS nurse. The ALS Clinic of Basel is, of course, in cooperation with many hospitals of the region, but also of other hospitals in all over Switzerland, with units of palliative care, home care, and patient organizations. As you know, assisted suicide is allowed in Switzerland, and there is the Article 115 in the Swiss Criminal Code, which says that a person who helps somebody for selfish motives to commit suicide or to attempt to commit suicide will be punished with a monetary penalty or with prison. But this is very vague. And this article doesn't say in detail what is with the person who commits suicide. There's nothing written down about that. And we had in Switzerland several campaigns to change that, political campaigns, but they were not successful. And therefore the Swiss Academy of Medical Sciences, they created the guidelines for assisted suicide. At time, to assist to a suicide it is not necessarily done by a healthcare worker, and the suicide is made when it is medically assisted through a dose of a narcotic, which is natrium pentobarbital 15 grams, not milligrams, grams. The most important points of these guidelines of the Swiss Academy of Medical Science are the unbearable suffering for the patient. Since 3 years, there has been a revision and patients do not longer have to be at the end of life. This is problematic, and it led to a rejection of these new guidelines by the Swiss Medical Association, so the association of us physicians, and this is difficult for us. The second point is the power of judgment. Patients should be able to recognize and to assess the situation properly. And the third point is that a wish to die has to be autonomous. It has to be well considered by the patient without any pressure from outside. And the wish should be constant. That means that it should last for a longer time, as months or weeks, or months or even years. And the important thing is that in assisted suicide, the patient is the person who carries out the final action. That is the difference to active euthanasia, where, for example, a physician gives a lethal dose of a drug, by, for example, by an injection. So, how is the rate of suicide and assisted suicide in Switzerland? As you can see, over the last 20 years, the rate of suicide has decreased continuously in Switzerland, also due to big national campaigns, because we have a rather big problem there. In contrast, the assisted suicides in Switzerland were always increasing. Let's have a look at the assisted suicides in Switzerland, in all Switzerland, and in the region of Basel. The first you have to look at is the orange part here. This is a rate, not a number, but a rate, because numbers are too high for this statistics. The rate increased over the last 20 years. The next one is the gray part. The grey part are assisted suicides in patients with neurological diseases counted by exit. They started to count this about 10 years ago, and this is one problem in Switzerland. We do not have an overall statistic by a national, statistical unit. We have a lot of publications that we have to collect together and to have an overview how many people commit assisted suicide per year. Now we have a look at the area of Basel. This is the yellow one. Here you see all patients with any diagnosis assisting suicide in our region. And in contrast, in blue, very fine here, the patients with ALS in our region committing assisted suicide. Let's have a look at those people in blue. So here you see all patients that committed assisted suicide in the area of Basel. These are the blue ones here, that are all patients with any diagnosis. And the red line, these are the patients, the ALS patients cared for in the ALS clinic of Kathi Schweigert at the University Hospital. And there you see that there's an increase of the patients overall, but the number of patients with ALS, they remain more or less constant. Why is it like that? We think that the trend, the ALS patients didn't follow the national trend because of the network of the ALS clinic. The clinic is very well known here in the region, and every physician who has or assumes the diagnosis of ALS sends the person to this ALS clinic because they know it's hard work to diagnose and also to care for the patient and the families. The ALS clinic, they care for the patients from diagnosis until end of life, so they care for the whole trajectory. They have a large interprofessional network and a cooperation with many other facilities outside, SPIT-IN and SPIT-X. And I think the most important thing is that there is a case management by an ALS nurse, which is this is Sabine Meyer, and she's very experienced, and she works in the clinic, and she goes also outside to the patients at home, in the hospital, in the nursing home, everywhere. And I think this continuity of care, this is the excellent point and of this clinic. So let's see, what do patients with ALS or other neurological diseases, what do they think about what do they think when they express a wish to die? What are the intentions and motivations for it? Just have a look. This is the interview study we conducted among the partners, the ALS clinic. Our research question was, what were the attitudes and concerns of patients about end of life and dying? Not only ALS patients, but also patients with cancer, 30, patients with frailty, 11, and patients with organ failure, also 11, and 10 patients with neurological diseases. So if you want to see the publications, go to the repository of the hospice in Park. This is the hospital, palliative care hospital, where I worked for 20 years until last year. So what we saw is that there are disease-related moments that trigger a wish to die, and which are very different compared to other trajectories. In neurological diseases, we saw that breathlessness, high dependency of care, but also the moment of considering tube feeding or considering respiratory support were important triggering factors to speak about wishes to die or for upcoming wishes to die. In all trajectories, immobilization, high dependency, care, and feeling of being a burden were important triggering factors. This goes in line with other publications, and especially with that of Mr. Stutzky about 7 years ago. He's also living here in the region and published on this topic. When you have a look at the patients in our study, just these of organ failure, neurological disease, and frailty, then you see that these patients have different wishes next to each other, which are also contradictory. So you see, most of them have a wish to live in green. Some of them have a wish to die at the moment of the interview. This is red. Some of them, they have an acceptance, which is not a wish to die, but to accept that the end of life will come. And some of them have wishes to die for the future. So when this and this comes, for example, suffocation or dependency of care and so on. And some patients have a high ambivalence of every wish, and they cannot decide what to do. Ambivalence in a certain degree is normal and is seen in every patient, but these patients were very stressed about that. Which intentions did we find in patients with neurological disease? Just one comment. These patients with 1 star, these are patients with a multiple sclerosis, and this is a patient with a other disease, but very similar in the clinical picture to ALS. So the intention were different. Some patients just wished or desired that end of life would come. This is it's not very strong. Some patients wanted end of life to come sooner and quicker, but they didn't do anything again for that. And the third part wanted to hasten death. There was one patient, member of EXIT, who had concrete plans to hasten death. However, these plans were always interrupted after 1 or 2 weeks or 1 month when he became better, when the symptom control was better, or when his agency was better. And he died in a natural way just after implantation of a feeding tube. He had a decompensation of breathing. And at that moment, he had no wish to die. He just expected a good summertime to come. So no one of these patients died by assisted suicide. Very often in this trajectory was a wish to die for the future. Here is one quote of a patient, a woman of about 60 years, 6 years after diagnosis and 2 years before her death. And she said, if you can't eat anymore, can't speak anymore, then I would say that the point has come when I just have to say that it isn't life any longer. And if you then help it along a little bit, I think that's legitimate. We try to find out what she meant with to help it a little. We didn't find out. She couldn't explain that. She did not want to commit assisted suicide. She was not member of Exit or another organization. And in the course of her disease, the wish to die vanished. And at the end of life, she had this, what she said there. She had breathlessness and she was high dependent on care. And she wanted a maximum of therapy then. So this wish can change. Motivations were predominantly suffocation, especially for wishes to die for the future, then dependency on care, but also the wish, the desire to die in peace, to die at home, to have control and agency, or to prevent a dementia. Here's one quote of a man with ALS in his 80s. He had a very fast ALS development. He was always sportive. He was never ill before. He had a son living abroad. He lived at home until end, and he said, I don't want to waste away miserably, but I want to leave this world in a state where I can remain somewhere in the memories of my children and my friends as someone who, well, you could talk to and who was reasonably normal. That means not all wishes to die for the future will remain if these circumstances then occur. It is probably important how touching a situation is already experienced at the time of the interview. And for me in practice, the wish to die for the future is not only a wish to die. It may be one, but it's more an expression how patients do not want to die and what their ideas are of a good death. And there I have to go into detail. And there is my point to start the communication and the dialogue. The other thing is that we always speak about wishes to die, wishes to hasten death, but we have too little attention on patients with hidden wishes or who never express a wish to die. And I think also in this speech, it's like that. We should be we should have a good ear to listen. Here's an example. A woman of 65 years with 7 years after diagnosis, she says, the problem is, he says, if you die, I do not want to live anymore. This is my enormous problem, so I can't even die in peace. And I often hurt him deliberately in order to create a distance, because it's still ringing in my ears. I'll kill myself. Nobody knew from the clinical team that this patient had a wish to die, a hidden wish to die. It came out in the interview. So how do I explore in in practice, about wishes to die, this is an algorithm that we worked out on the base of our research. I do ask, what do you think, where are you in your illness? This is a common beginning of a dialogue that you already know, and I ask them, what do they wish for the future? And the key sentence, the key question is, have you ever had the wish to put an end to it? The life, the treatment, the pain, the drugs, whatever. And then you have to give a lot of room to the answer. If the answer is yes, you ask, do you think that for now or for the future? And then you give them room to explain, to give the narrative they have, to speak about what they are afraid of: suffocation, pain, dependency, loss of agency, hopelessness, and so on. And then make an advance directive, go into detail and plan with them. How do they want to manage them? How do they want to create a life period where they have the agency for themselves? And when they say no, we often forget, we skip, we say, okay, fine, we go ahead. No, do not do that. Give also room to the question, is this a difficult question for you? And explore hidden wishes to die. I think this is very, very important. And our patients have big antennas to see and to hear and to feel whether we are ready to hear what they say or not. And important is to finish this dialogue with, whatever you decide, I am here for you. Yes, we have assisted suicide. We also have palliative care in Switzerland on a high level. But what we see is that many physicians of primary care, they feel unease with decision-making, communication at end of life, and handling with suicidal wishes. You see it here in this survey that was made by Klaus Balli and published by Stefanie Gietzendanner. And she saw that GPs, family doctors, they felt it is not so important to speak about end of life care, decision-making, or wishes to die. And they said they felt not confident for that. Now the question is, what was first? Yes, there's a need of training. And I think in this situation, we always have to reflect as professionals of our own perspective. Does the wish to die fit into the story? Has palliative care been exhausted? What is my attitude? Did I talk to a colleague, to my peer, to a specialist? And if I feel it is too much of a burden, can I delegate the task? I think this would be honest and important. Self-perceived burden is very common in patients with ALS and especially at end of life in high dependency. It's perhaps also the role of a modern patient in our Western society. I think it's important that it is a bidirectional thing. It's a question of relationship also, and there are two sides of a mirror. There is the side of feeling to be a burden, a speechlessness to speak about, anxiety of the family and a feeling of guilt. But there is also a reaction of the relatives to give love, and this mitigates the feelings of being a burden. We have seen that in many times, but we have to speak and we have to help the families to speak. That is the professional task. So you see here the quote of a woman, of a wife of a patient. He said, yes, it's time for me to go soon. And she says, don't ever say that again. That isn't a reason. You see, she wants to abolish that. Most important to help these families is to care for one's own health, concerning the families to accept health, and for us professionals to give a best symptom management and to avoid embarrassing situations as falls or incontinency or delirium like that. The conclusion is palliative care is a need for all patients and their families. Assisted suicide is used by some patients, but then it is important to deal it with professionality together and to have formation in that, to have the correct dialogue, the correct communication, and the correct decision making in end-of-life care, especially in ALS. And also in Switzerland, a lot of training of professionals is warranted for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Goudet, for that really fascinating and informative talk with such positive messages. I really enjoyed that, thank you. And I'd like to introduce our second speaker now, who is Remco van Enenam from Utrecht in the Netherlands. And he's going to talk about discussing personalised prognosis of survival in ALS. So thank you, Dr. Remco.
Hello everybody, my name is Remco van Enenam. I'm a PhD student at the Rehabilitation Department at the UMC Utrecht in the Netherlands. And it is my pleasure and honor today to tell you more about the experiences of patients, caregivers and physicians with discussing personalized prognosis. To start off, I would like to declare that none of the authors have any competing interests. In 2018, colleagues of ours, Westerling and others, published the NCAL survival prediction model. In their discussion, they stated that this model may help patients to maintain a degree of autonomy and help them plan their lives. However, in response to this publication, a number of questions and concerns were raised, for example by Mitsumoto, who emphasized that doctors must always use this information with great care and sensitivity. In response to these questions and concerns, we first developed a communication guide to support physicians in tailoring discussion of personalized prognosis to the needs of the patient and their family. This communication guide we published at the end of 2020. Then we conducted a follow-up study to explore patient, caregiver and physician experiences with discussing personalized prognosis. And today, I would like to tell you more about the results of this follow-up study. This follow-up study was a qualitative study using semi-structured interviews and a focus group. For these interviews, we recruited recently diagnosed patients with ALS and their caregivers who were offered the opportunity to discuss a more personalized prognosis by their physician. Additionally, we conducted a focus group with physicians who discussed the personalized prognosis with the patients. In total, we interviewed 13 patients with ALS and 9 caregivers, with a nice spread in prognostic groups from short to very long. And in our focus group, we had 4 rehabilitation physicians and 1 neurologist. The first overarching theme from our interviews was the importance of tailored communication when discussing the personalized prognosis. Patients and caregivers told us that tailored communication mediated the emotional impact of the prognosis and improved their satisfaction with the consultation. Participants said that a person-centered communication style tailored to their emotional needs was essential to good communication by the physician, as shown by the top right quote of a patient who found it special that the physician tried to assess what kind of person she was. Participants also wanted prognostic disclosure to be tailored to their information needs. The second overarching theme participants talked about were personal factors like coping style, illness experiences, and information needs, which also mediated the emotional impact. These sub-themes were strongly interrelated with each other, but not with role, gender, or prognosis. Most participants in our study displayed a down-to-earth and problem-focused coping style, like the patient on the top right, who felt he could now take action, knowing his prognosis. Older patients and caregivers often showed a more accepting coping style. And one patient reported a more avoidant coping style early on in the disease because his brother had also died of ALS, only a few months after his diagnosis. Which brings us to illness experiences. Some participants had prior experiences with illness, which affected how they reacted to their prognosis. It could be ALS, as I already mentioned, but also, for example, dementia within the family. Additionally, many patients reported that they already had an expectation about what their personalized prognosis would be, based on their experience with the rate of disease progression. In contrast, caregivers often had a strong need for confirmation of what the patient already expected. Finally, information needs varied between participants, from just an approximation to detailed discussion of the prediction model. The third overarching theme was the emotional impact of the prognosis. As we already saw, this was mediated by tailored communication and personal factors. Additionally, none of the patients or caregivers said that the personalized prognosis caused them anxiety or to lose hope. Many patients and caregivers were happy because they felt they had been given more time and room to breathe by their personalized prognosis, like the patient on the top right, and they felt reassured because their prognosis was now more concrete. Older patients with a short prognosis often displayed an accepting coping style, reflecting on a happy and long life, like the patient in the middle on the right. And one patient on the bottom right expressed regret because the result was worse than the average life expectancy they'd been told about at their diagnosis. The fourth and final overarching theme is regaining control over the future. During the interviews, patients and caregivers spent much more time discussing the impact of the prognosis on their future rather than the emotional impact. They told us they found it helpful looking towards the future because it alleviated uncertainty and provided clarity or peace, as the caregiver on the top right says. Additionally, it helped patients to regain control and to redefine and plan for their future, including their future care. Now you can start planning something, says the patient in the middle. Finally, patients emphasized the importance of quality of life over quantity of time remaining and hoped for a satisfactory quality of life for as long as possible. In this figure, you can see the different overarching themes and sub-themes in relationship to each other, and how tailored communication and personal factors mediate the emotional impact. Finally, the focus group of physicians. They told us that they recognized the patient and caregiver themes and underscored the positive experiences of patients and caregivers. Except for the one patient mentioned before, none of their patients expressed regret at a later time over discussing their prognosis. Besides this, they also discussed a number of benefits and barriers. Benefits included that discussing personalized prognosis is not that different or more difficult from other bad news conversations. Moreover, it can provide valuable information to the physician and can enhance personalized care. One important barrier is the difficulty in discussing the prognosis when there's a language barrier or cultural difference between patient and physician. Overall, our results were similar to findings in other life-limiting diseases. Discussing personalized prognosis does not have an adverse impact on psychological well-being of patients and caregivers as long as the communication is tailored to their needs. Furthermore, studies show that an unfulfilled desire for a more personalized prognosis can cause distress to patients and caregivers. On the other hand, our study shows, together with other studies, that if you do discuss the personalized prognosis, this can help patients to regain a sense of control, redefine and plan for the future, focus on the present and their quality of life, and align clinical and end-of-life decision-making with their values and preferences. However, there's also an important barrier to discussing personalized prognosis, which can be the presence of a language barrier or difference in culture and values between the patient and the physician. This is also a limitation to our study, since we were unable to include these kinds of patients. However, we have included recommendations on this topic in our communication guide. So what would I like you to take home from this presentation and our results? I would like you to take home that personalized prognosis can be discussed with patients with ALS who want information about their individual life expectancy and with their caregivers, and with minimal adverse emotional impact. How this is discussed is as important as what is discussed, and for this, a person-centered communication tailored to the emotional and information needs of patients and their families is crucial. Additionally, discussing personalized prognosis can help patients and caregivers to regain control and facilitate planning of the future, including future care. Finally, quality of life matters more to patients than quantity of time remaining. For this study, I would like to acknowledge and extend many thanks to all the people with ALS and their family members who shared their stories and their time with us. This was a very inspiring and humbling process, and I would like to thank you very much for this. First of all, I would also like to thank Lulu Koppenol, my master's student on this project, who did a really great job, and the rest of our research team, Anita Belen, Willeke Kruithof, Esther Kruitwagen, Sotis Pieters, Michael van Es, Leonard van den Berg, and Anne Visser-Meili. And I would be happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for another really informative and stimulating talk. Thank you so much for that. And I'm now going to introduce the third and last talk in our section, and this is a double act. It's Mark Heverin and Miriam Galvin from Dublin in Ireland, and they're going to talk about the findings from a European survey of ALS. Thank you.
So my name is Mark Heverin, and I am the research manager at the Academic Unit of Neurology in Trinity College, Dublin. My colleague Miriam Galvin and I, Miriam is the lead on our health services research strand in the Academic Unit of Neurology. So today we're presenting top-line results from the Impact ALS Europe survey, which we have been working on over the course of the last couple of years. We'd firstly like to say thanks for the wonderful opportunity to speak at the International Symposium. The Impact ALS Europe survey continues the work of the original Impact survey in the US back in 2017, which was also sponsored by Cytokinetics, Biogen and Ionis, and the survey platforming and initial data processing were carried out in this instance by Apothecom UK. So the advisory committee steering this survey is made up of co-investigators from sites across the 9 participating countries and the 3 industry partners who also supported the earlier Impact US survey. So the 9 participating countries can be seen in the map on this slide, and they included Ireland, UK, France, Spain, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Sweden, and Italy. So I'm just going to take you through some of the survey methodology then, how the questionnaires came about. First of all, our goals for Impact ALS Europe were the same as the US survey, in that we wanted to quantify and improve understanding of the functional burden of disease in ALS to ensure that the patient and caregiver voice is included in the development and evaluation of new therapies by delivering a robust evidence base for the burden of ALS from the perspective of the patient and caregiver, while ensuring a scientifically rigorous approach to facilitate publication and overall impact in the context of regulatory review of new therapeutic options. So the surveys were adapted from the original Impact US survey in 2017. And we have a patient, a caregiver, and a bereaved caregiver questionnaire. They were developed, and the questions were then reviewed by the partners, our industry partners, and the advisory committee. We then moved to the ethics approval process. through Trinity College Dublin. And then we moved to translate the surveys and platform the survey on Qualtrics. And then we put the survey out into the field between October and December of 2020. So 3 subgroups responded to this survey: people with ALS, caregivers of people with ALS, and bereaved caregivers. So the main difference between the caregivers and bereaved caregiver surveys was around the wording of the questions. This slide outlines the modules or different sections of the survey for the 3 subgroups. So in terms of survey recruitment, on the right-hand side of the current slide is an example of the online recruitment flyers used for the survey. So they were adapted to the local language in each case. Voluntary organisations in most participating countries were a great support in publicising the survey and in reporting participant feedback and real-time issues to us that respondents encountered with the survey, which meant assistance could be provided to make the respondent experience a little better. So I'm going to take you through some of the basic results before handing you over to my colleague Miriam. And first of all, we have just the basic demographics. So the total number of respondents to the survey was 1,538, which was very similar to the overall response to the US survey. 870 respondents were people with ALS, of whom 132 were completed by somebody on behalf of the person with ALS if they were unable to do so themselves. So of the 668 caregivers, 450 were currently providing care. 218 had been caregivers of now deceased people with ALS, while patients, caregivers, and bereaved caregivers were all presented with similar surveys as shown in an earlier slide. Respondents from each of the 3 groups may have chosen not to answer certain questions as the survey went on, meaning we have differing numbers of respondents depending on the question, the particular question being asked at any one point. So then just some further demographics. Of those who answered, the majority of all respondents fell in the age brackets between 55 and 74, which fits with the expected age profile in this cohort. We were surprised to see a relatively high rate of male respondents across all 3 subgroups. The number of respondents across each of the survey subgroups for each of the countries can be seen in the table to the right of this slide. So while Italy had a large number of the total respondents to this survey, we can see they had relatively few bereaved caregivers. Conversely, Spain had a more modest proportion of overall responses, but a very high number of bereaved caregivers. So trends like this in the data will be explored further in the subsequent analysis to examine if there was something unique to the recruitment pathway or publicity around the survey at individual sites that may have driven this. So this slide just explores the demographics a little bit further and shows the respondents from across the participating countries. The individual country totals were based on the numbers responding to the country of residence question in the survey, and not everybody responded to this question, so it won't add up to the total amount. But again, we can see in this slide the high response rate in Italy. In further analyses around country response rates, we'll consider response rate as a function of ALS population and a function of total population in each of the countries involved. So I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Miriam to talk you through some of the further top-line results.
Thank you for that, Mark. We will now look at some of the results of living with ALS from the survey respondents. Respondents were asked to identify symptoms in the past 2 weeks. Bereaved caregivers were asked about symptoms of the person with ALS in the last 2 weeks of their loved one's life. Weakness in the hands, arms, and feet and legs, and fatigue were the most commonly reported symptoms. Loss of interest or apathy, speech problems, and swallowing problems were reported more frequently by caregivers than by people with ALS. Other symptoms reported included erratic emotional responses, cramping, and bladder problems. This slide shows the main symptoms people want treatment to impact beneficially. Overall, for all 3 subgroups, disease progression and respiratory function were identified as the most important things for treatment to beneficially impact. Mobility, communication, and muscle weakness were mentioned frequently also. It will be interesting to look in more detail at the preferences by subgroup, that is the person with ALS, the caregiver, and the bereaved caregiver, in our further analysis to explore potential differences between these subgroups in the responses. This graph follows on from the previous one and shows the rankings given to the symptoms identified that people want treatment to impact beneficially. Respiratory function and disease progression were ranked as the first choice for treatment to impact beneficially. Most respondents, in fact, 3/4 of respondents, reported that the person with ALS had fears about the future. The graph on the right of the slide shows the future fears of those people with ALS as reported by themselves, by their caregivers, current and bereaved. The most common fears reported by people with ALS involved leaving my family too soon, being isolated from family and friends, and dying from respiratory failure. Current caregivers reported spending savings on medical care as a fear, more so than people with ALS did themselves. This slide lists some of the other future fears of people, as reported by people with ALS, their caregivers, and bereaved caregivers. This includes being a burden, suffering, losing autonomy, not seeing children grow up, for example. Looking at stress levels for caregivers in the last 2 weeks, they were reported at high and maximum levels, as we see on the slide here, especially for bereaved caregivers. Bereaved caregivers were asked about their own stress levels in the last 2 weeks of their loved ones' lives, which may go some way to explaining the elevated stress levels for that subgroup. It's also important to note that the results reflect stress across all caregivers and patient severities. For example, stress levels overall not broken down by caregiver burden. This is very much there for a top-line result that needs to be more deeply analysed to tease out what's going on here in more detail. We asked caregivers about their current health status. From this, we see that most caregivers describe their current health status as fair to good in the 2 weeks prior to survey completion. Most caregivers indicated that their current health is worse, much worse, or somewhat worse than before they began caring for the person with ALS. We plan as well to explore this in more detail in the upcoming analysis, because we have to consider that time passing as well as caregiving itself could be a factor in the deterioration of a person's health. So in conclusion and some of the next steps. So the data we have gathered from the European Impact ALS survey has given us information on the disease experience of over 1,500 respondents. We have a rich source of data for detailed international comparison among the countries in Europe who participated, and also with the United States data, which was completed as part of a 2017 survey. So we have an analysis plan in place for targeted data mining, and the data we believe will be useful for the treatment and drug development. And to this end, we have linked in with the European Medicines Agency and presented our top-line results during the year, just as the American data were presented at the Federal Drug Administration there. And we hope to maintain our links with the EMA going forward for any future analysis we're carrying out. Thank you for your attention and any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mark Heverin and Miriam Galvin. That was a really interesting talk, and thank you to all our speakers. Now we're into the question and answer session, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Christina Full.
Hello. Yes, I'd like to also say thank you. Very, very interesting data and findings that we've heard there. I just want to kick off with something that I'd like you each to comment on, if that's okay, because I think there is a theme here about living with motor neuron disease, what it's like. The burden of that came up quite a lot in each of your presentations, I think. So if we could go around the four of you and say, what's the main thing you think you've learned about living with the burden of motor neuron disease, and if possible, how people can be best helped with that? So if it's all right, Remco, could I go to you first with that question? Would that be okay?
Of course. Thank you for this question. Yeah, particularly at the start of the disease, I think a lot of patients and caregivers are very much interested in more information and more clarity on their situation. So a number of patients would like to have a more personalized prognosis, and especially caregivers, because it helps them to plan for the future, plan for future care, and this relieves their initial stress levels and their burden, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Miriam, shall I come to you next for a comment on that?
Well, I think well, our research and the research we've heard, I think burden is a complex point, and obviously it's a burdensome condition, and it's all acknowledged. Caregivers and patients have burdens, but living, as Heike's data showed, the quality of life that one has is seen as important perhaps as the quantity. So in terms of the burden, I think what our data show is the different perspectives of burden. The fact that we have a triangulation of patient caregiver and bereaved caregiver, asking them the same questions, we find actually that the burden is constructed differently by different people. All patients don't construct burden the same way. There's objective measures of burden, which we can assess externally, and there's subjective measures of burden, which come from within the person. So I think rather than just seeing burden as a monolithic entity, I think we need to be aware of the complexities of it and how it varies over time within the same person and across different people as well.
Thank you. And Heike, could I ask you to comment what your learning is?
Yes, I also think there are many reasons for having a high burden, but I think the most important thing is to have agency for the patient and also for the family, to be informed, to have a good communication with professionals, and the most important, I think, is to have a trajectory that is care for from the beginning to the end, that you have a case manager who knows about the situation, not to explain again and again, and to have professionals who have the language of the patient, as we have heard, a tailored communication to the situation of the whole care unit of patient and family. I think this continuity is one of the most important things, not to be afraid, not to be desperate. I think I think in my practice, this is the most important thing, to be there.
Thank you. And coming to you, Mark, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure. I'd kind of reflect on the survey that we've done, and then more widely, and it's kind of maybe an expansion of Miriam's point, just to say that from my experience, one size doesn't fit all, and what's burdensome for one is maybe different from somebody else. So we're focused a lot on the voice of the patient and by extension the voice of the caregiver. So I think my major learning is to sort of stay open to what fits for one person really doesn't for somebody else. So I think we need to keep building up the picture around burden, and basically it's quite different for different people. That would be my learning so far, and people are keen to tell us what is burdensome for them. So from our ongoing research, people are keen to engage with this. So I think it's a picture we can certainly build on through research, like from all of the three talks today.
Super, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Amar to pick up some of the questions that people have been sending in now. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is a question for Heike. Is there a quality of access to assistive dying? For example, in those who are poor, those with learning difficulties or mental illness who may struggle to access all types of good care, but may equally wish to die but find it hard to access this service. And really related to that, sorry, Heike, before you...
Slowly, yes.
Do you want me to ask it again? Okay. Is there a quality of access to assistive dying? That's the question. So particularly in people who may have difficulty accessing the service, how does that affect their ability to access it?
Yeah, no, there is no, yeah. It's open. We try to have a low access that everybody can discuss about this theme, and I think the most important thing is to have access to the center of excellence, to the neurologic clinic, where we can start with the dialogue, and to know whether somebody has a wish to die is always part of this dialogue. But you are right, when we have a look at the patients, then patients coming from abroad or patients with difficulties to understand the German language, this is our language, the access is not so good, and we have to work on that. I think it's not, it's not always fair.
And how do you think, does your research help at all with countries, for example, that don't have palliative care? For example, I think in Belgium there is no speciality of palliative care. How do you think that impacts the decision? or might impact the decision based on
I
your
think this is
information?
I think that is crucial because if you have a liberal system concerning euthanasia or assisted dying, and you have no palliative care and no specialized palliative care just for ALS, not for cancer but for ALS, this is dangerous, I think, because it's really, this is essential that patients have the access to palliative care, and then they perhaps decide to commit assisted suicide. But without that, with a bad symptom management, or with feeling to be a burden and no access to help or to facilities, I think this would be very, very dangerous. And I think this is a problem for Switzerland also, because in every country the money is, it's getting worse, and the comfort, the quality of care is sometimes it's in discussion, because there's no money or there is no facility, and I think it will be difficult on the long run to work with this assisted suicide or with euthanasia if the quality of care doesn't fit. I think it's not easy, and
Okay. Thank you, Christina.
not an easy task.
Thank you. I think we've had a couple of questions about how the data in Mark and Miriam's study might actually be used in drug development. I don't know if you're able to comment on that.
Miriam, will I jump in here?
You go first, Mark. Yeah.
Sure. So I suppose the two most important, or the two most relevant areas maybe to that are well, the first one is we literally asked patients, caregivers, and bereaved caregivers what their preferred symptom for treatment was. So obviously this study was sponsored by three of our industry partners. So they're actually keen to get the patient voice into into the symptoms that are actually targeted. Naturally people gravitated in the top line results towards the broadest, I suppose, the broadest sort of ceasing the progression of motor neuron disease. But we found some kind of interesting things around fatigue as well. So I think, we're kind of keen to look more broadly about the different sort of symptoms that could be treated, and people's perceptions on them. So again, it's back to that idea of the voice of the patient, and to actually include them in the drug development journey, so that it's not drug companies or even researchers operating in isolation, just on assumptions.
Okay, thank you. And if I may follow that up, I think I picked up correctly that your recruitment and data collection in your study was during COVID. Yeah, well, we're still in COVID times, but at that time it was profoundly.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you have any comment on how the recruitment was affected, but particularly, was there any sort of flavour of what the patient voice was saying about living with ALS in the time of COVID? So might it be a particular voice that we're hearing there?
Yeah, so the first thing to say, I suppose, is, it was firmly in the grip of COVID. There's no doubt about that. So I'm sure there was some effect of it, most definitely. In terms of recruitment, we extended the window because it was slow initially, and I think it was slow initially because I think people were maybe, to use a phrase, bamboozled by all that was going on at the time. So they were at home, and they probably people had more time and probably more ability to engage with an online survey. But there was quite a lot going on. I know in Ireland certainly people were glued to the news. It had become slightly old news at that stage, but was kind of coming back into the fore again. So it certainly had an effect on people. I think overall it probably did slow people down in terms of their uptake of the actual survey. In terms of what the experience was like of living with COVID, or responding to this survey in the time of COVID, I suspect we'll pick up some nuggets of that when we look into the more text-based answers. So where people have maybe expanded on their answers. We haven't actually got to that just yet. But I think it will be very, very interesting, and I think we'll rely heavily on some of those nuggets to maybe give us a guide on how people experienced it during COVID. So I don't know if you've anything to add to that.
But just to follow on that, Mark, I think actually when looking at the future fears, COVID actually did come up, COVID and pandemics as expressed, not by lots and lots of people, but they actually did come up as figures. I think also the other effect could be, it's strange that when we look at the American survey, for which the European survey was a copy, if you like, obviously it's very difficult to compare results due to COVID, etc. But the similarities in some of the responses, if you want to say pre and post COVID, but they're still patients and carers, were very, very similar. So it's almost, we can't say COVID didn't affect the results, because obviously it affected people and could have exacerbated stress levels and could have caused, people not attending services as well, health services, and they may have been at home. So those things, as Mark said, might come out in the more text-based, but it's interesting to look at, say, the top line results such as fears, treatment, symptoms. They're very similar to what was in the American study, which happened before COVID and in a different context. And I think that's one of the advantages, hopefully, of the work we did and the sponsors did and everybody partook, that we can look at some comparative data within Europe, cross-country, who all had COVID at the same time, and with the American population pre-COVID. So it's allowed us a couple of opportunities to explore those other things in greater detail.
Thanks very much. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Emma.
Thank you. This is a question for Remco. Who should be involved in having these conversations about personalised prognosis? Should it be the neurologist, the multidisciplinary colleagues, an ALS specialist nurse, a psychologist? And how much time do you think that might take? Because presumably it does need to be patient-centred and tailored specifically.
Yes, thank you for this very, very good question. I would like to start with the last portion of the question. How much time will it take? Our interview showed that discussing the prognosis itself doesn't take much time. It's especially the responding to the emotions, to the follow-up questions by the family and the patient, that takes up more time. So situating the prognosis within the personalized trajectory of the patient, so to say. And who should discuss it? We have also discussed it in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, it's a bit different than in a lot of other countries. Here, the neurologist gives the diagnosis to the patient, and then the rehabilitation physician is in charge of care for the patient. So in our case, almost all discussions took place by the rehabilitation physician. So I think it's really, if other countries want to take this up, it's on how is the care arranged in that country and who do they think is best suited to do this discussion. And I heard a lot of good suggestions with the psychologist, the neurologist, maybe someone else within the team who has a good access to the patient. So that's really up to the country themselves, I think.
Okay, thank you. And I have a follow-up question, which is related to uncertainty, because actually there's a great deal of uncertainty about prognosis, as you know. And I know several of my colleagues do the same. I shy away from being certain about prognosis when I'm discussing with my patients, because you can't be with an individual. It's actually too variable. And I wondered if you had any advice. Does your study, for example, tell us that we should be more certain and more prescriptive, even though we might be wrong, or should we retain that level of uncertainty when we're giving that information?
Well, I cannot give prescriptions on that, but I would certainly not shy away from keeping the uncertainty in. We have advised ourselves to keep it within a certain range, focus on the interquartile range, so the 50% chance where the patient may come out. And that provides more certainty than the average for all patients. But yeah, don't pin it down on a year or a number of months, because that can never be right.
Okay, thank you. Chris?
Thank you. So there are lots of questions coming through about the context of physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, and we may have time for some of those, but specifically for your presentation, Heike, have you any experience, data, opinion on whether whether assisted suicide rather than euthanasia leads to people with ALS undertaking that choice earlier than they may wish to because of the functionality that they need to do it themselves. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, yeah. It's a similar problem in dementia, when people have to commit suicide earlier than time has come because they're not able anymore to do it. Yes, this is a problem. And I personally, I saw it in some patients that they had to decide to commit suicide very early because they saw that they got frontal dementia and they did not want to suffer this. And we see it in some cases, not often, but this is a problem. This is also a problem for the family, because to decide to care for a patient who has to die too early, this is in some way too early, is difficult for the family, and the bereavement is higher than normally, and they have to be cared for a long time after the death of the patient. Yes, it's a problem.
Thank you. And something slightly related, because in the UK context where it's not legal, a lot of people who wish to take this option may choose to go to Switzerland at a time that may or may not be too early. But there's some questions about your opinion of whether this is commercialization of allowing people to have that choice or a valuable service. And that's an opinion rather than it's evidence from your project that you've presented, I know.
Yes, that's an opinion. Oh, it's difficult. I think it's cruel to have to leave the own country to do these things in another culture, in another environment that you do not know. As I heard from the two organizations in Switzerland who offer this, that they do not gain any money with that. I don't know whether it's right or not. I think it's difficult, and it would be better if there would be possibilities in the own countries to have a good solution rather than go to another country and to come into a totally strange culture and to be I think the whole construct is difficult.
Yes. Thank you for sharing your opinion on that. But
I'm sorry?
Thank you for sharing your opinion. I appreciate that it is an opinion rather than your research.
No,
and I'm going to hand back to Amal.
Thank you. Remco, another question for you. Do you have any data on the accuracy of your personalised prognosis?
No, particularly where these patients were concerned. Most of them are still alive, thankfully. So we don't have the accuracy from these patients. But the original model by Henk-Jan Westerding, he showed that it was pretty accurate in his paper.
And presumably, as treatments come online or may modify survival, then you'll have to modify it anyway.
Yeah, then the people in our lab will have to work on a new model for that, for sure. Yes.
Sure. Heike, it's another question for you. Could you comment on predictors of choosing assisted suicide, specifically sex, marital status, and disease stage? No. I see. I think there is no. There are no studies in Switzerland on it. It's just my experience as a physician. No, I do not see constellations or clusters of symptoms that lead to assisted suicide. I do not see that. I'm sorry. Okay.
No. I think it's important to ask it always, to come into a dialogue. I think this is the important thing. You cannot predict whether a patient will commit assisted suicide or not, and you have to be open in every person. And sometimes my experience is that there are patients, especially old patients, where you think they are an older generation, conservative, they do not think about that, and it's not true. You just have to ask, and you have to open the dialogue, and sometimes it's surprising what they tell you. I think you have always be open.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, and thank you to all of our speakers. That's the end of our session now. Thank you very much for a very challenging, thought-provoking and interesting session.
Thank you.
It was very good.
Yes,
Thank you.